All right. Well, let's get this session going. The first part of the WMA meeting here is to talk about Tree of Heaven, Ailanthus altissima. It's a common invasive plant in California. It's rated by Cal-IPC, and it's a noxious weed on the state list. It's not only a bad weed in its own part, it's also a preferred host for an important insect pest that hasn't made it to California yet, as you'll hear about. We're fortunate to have a couple of colleagues with a lot of experience here from Solano County to share their expertise with us. So leading off is Ed King. He is the Agricultural Commissioner for Solano County. He'll be talking about planning and how to prioritize where to go after Tree of Heaven. So let's bring Ed onto stage so he can be heard.
I can't find Ed on the stage right now. Maybe he can.
Okay. Yeah, scrolling through all of those.
I can't get to him down there. So if Nikki
there's a little scroll thing. I can get him. Where are you? There he is. Hey, Ed.
Hey, good morning, Doug.
Good morning. All right, I'm gonna leave you here, and I'll pop back on in a few minutes.
Okay, great. Hey, good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you all, and thanks to Cal-IPC first off here for once again organizing and hosting us for the statewide WMA meeting. It's really important to have this continuity in the WMA community and keep us all together. So I think, with invasive species or controlling invasive species, are all about partnerships, and really that's kind of what the purpose of WMA is. So this is a great help to all of us. So for my talk this morning, I'm going to describe an approach to Tree of Heaven that I hope we can use to create some new urgency or impetus towards controlling Tree of Heaven. So I think we can move on to the next slide here, Doug. So Doug mentioned Tree of Heaven, of course, is a state-listed noxious weed. And you know what, by the way, that term noxious weed is defined in state law in Food and Ag Code section 5004. And just keep that in mind as we go through the symposium here. You may hear more from Doug in the next couple of days here about AB 2509, and that we do have a couple new definitions of integrated pest management and invasive species going into the Food and Ag Code now as well. So just kind of food for thought there. And then that's Title III of the California Code of Regulations, Section 4500 actually defines our state noxious weed list. So at times you may hear someone refer to the 4500 list, or so in any case, that's what they're referencing, our state list of noxious weeds. And we also have an action-oriented pest rating system in California that's also defined in regulation. But Tree of Heaven, CDFA is assigned a C rating. So that means it's a pest that's generally of common occurrence and likely well distributed throughout the state. And then on top of all that, Cal-IPC is assigned a moderate rating to Tree of Heaven. So we can move on to the next slide here. So admittedly, throughout my career in the Ag Commissioner system, I've mostly, or if not wholly, ignored Tree of Heaven, but I've had an epiphany or awakening of sorts in recent years, kind of spurred on by another invasive species, the spotted lanternfly. Spotted lanternfly is an invasive plant hopper. It's native to East Asia, and it was inadvertently introduced into Pennsylvania over a decade ago. And since that time, it has become widely established in the Northeast US, and it's threatening to spread westward. So the problem with spotted lanternfly, multiple problems with it, but it has an extensive host list, including fruit trees, nut trees, and grapevines. So it's a significant agricultural pest. In fact, in Pennsylvania, it's been found to feed in large enough numbers in vineyards to actually kill and wipe out total vineyards. So, and then when they feed in mass in large numbers, they also excrete large amounts of honeydew, which creates a good substrate for sooty mold, which can be an ag pest, but it also makes spotted lanternfly a significant nuisance pest in residential settings. And then, of course, because they have such a wide host list, they feed on oak and willow and maple and a whole range of other trees in wildlands and other natural settings. So, but here's the catch with spotted lanternfly, is that its preferred host is tree of heaven, also native to Asia. So, and then we think, in fact, that the spotted lanternfly may have a more difficult time establishing in a given area and thriving there if they don't have access to tree of heaven. So we're working on this premise that if we control or eliminate tree of heaven in certain areas, we can make it more difficult for spotted lanternfly to establish here in the maybe likely event that it does arrive here in California. So on the East Coast, spotted lanternfly has one life cycle, one generation per year. They go through 4 juvenile life stages or instars, as you can see here on the bottom of the slide, before they transition into winged adults in the summer or into late fall. So they can jump and fly short distances. They can be moved by the wind. Fortunately, on the East Coast, hard freezes in the fall and the winter will kill off adults, but they overwinter as egg masses, and this is probably the most one of the most significant challenges with spotted lanternflies, that they lay their egg masses on a wide variety of surfaces, trees, fence posts, stones, but more troublesome, they could also lay egg masses on vehicles, RVs, rail cars, containers, firewood, all these items that could be easily moved to locations where spotted lanternfly isn't currently present. And also problematic, and a significant concern for us, is that unlike a lot of the invasive species that we are concerned with, we don't currently have a good early detection trap for spotted lanternfly, that there's no effective pheromone lure like we use for so many other invasive insects. Okay, how about the next slide, please? So this is the current lay of the land, the current status on the East Coast with spotted lanternfly. All the blue shaded counties are areas where there are current infestations. So you can see there's now infestations in counties as far west as Illinois, down into Tennessee, and there's isolated occurrences all the way up to Vermont and as far south as North Carolina. So over the past couple of years in California, a couple actions that we've taken proactively here, that CDFA has designated spotted lanternfly as an A-rated pest. We established a state exterior quarantine probably 2 years ago now that restricts movement of plants and other material from these northeastern states that may harbor spotted lanternfly. The county ag departments, along with CDFA, have been doing risk-based surveys during the summer months, mostly at tree of heaven sites and vineyards, looking for spotted lanternfly. Border stations inspect incoming traffic. In fact, you may have seen earlier this summer or last summer in the news that there was the Truckee border station intercepted a large metal sculpture coming in from the East Coast, destined for Sonoma County. And when the border station inspected the sculpture, they found multiple spotted lanternfly egg masses. So the sculpture was cleaned and then admitted entry. But when it arrived in Sonoma County, and they were able to unload the sculpture, and the ag department was able to do a more thorough inspection. They found even more egg masses. So that was can just go to show just how scary this is and how easily those egg masses could make it into the state. And just superb work by our colleagues over in the Sonoma County Ag Department to make those additional detections and almost certainly stave off a new introduction of spotted lanternfly. And then there's also air cargo inspections happening as well that unfortunately it's proving not uncommon to find dead or moribund spotted lanternfly in air freight traffic. Fortunately, they don't seem to travel well on airplanes, at least long distances. So I think we can move on here, please. Next slide, please. So here's a couple maps showing the likelihood or the spotted lanternfly habitat suitability. The one on the right is from USDA, and then the one on the left is from North Carolina State, showing the likelihood of introduction and spread the spotted lanternfly all the way here to California in the next few decades. You can see that, of course, the Central Valley and the coast look like likely candidates for us to see spotted lanternfly. Next slide, please. So here in Northern California, we have a lot of grapes, and the purple shaded areas here on the map are grapevines, and then the green dots are either quads where spotted lanternfly or tree of heaven is present, or individual locations where we have tree of heaven occurrences. So we have almost 250,000 acres of wine grapes across Northern California here, from Mendocino and Lake counties down through Sonoma, across Napa, Solano, across the Delta, San Joaquin, Sacramento counties, then all up into the Sierra foothills too. So, and these are all areas where tree of heaven is present, if not prevalent. How about next slide? So locally here in Solano County, our premier vineyard and winery region is Suisun Valley, and we have about 4,000 acres of wine grapes and about 15 wineries here in Suisun Valley. And the Wine Institute and the California Association of Wine Grape Growers estimate that our wine industry, grape industry here in Solano generates about $550 million in economic activity each year. So it's a significant ag industry for us. I mean, we're just over the ridge from Napa and Sonoma as well. So significant economic driver in Solano County. And the thing with Suisun Valley is that it's bordered on three sides by the Coast Range Mountains. So it's kind of this defined and contained area where we could take a manageable and kind of proactive approach to surveying, mapping, and controlling tree of heaven. So in protection of our vineyards primarily, with the intent of this proactive step of depriving spotted lanternfly of its preferred host, and therefore, creating this buffer against potential introduction and establishment of spotted lanternfly. So we have a very active vintners and growers association. So I started this project probably 3 years ago now, by meeting with growers, meeting with our winemakers, educating them on that early threat of spotted lanternfly, and getting them up to speed on tree of heaven as well. And as I've talked with them through time, a lot of them recognize tree of heaven, but they didn't quite understand what it was. So I've taken some of them, our winemakers and a couple of grape growers, on tours of Suisun Valley and pointed out tree of heaven to them and kind of explained what we would like to do in partnering with them in trying to rid Suisun Valley of tree of heaven. So what we've been doing is scouting and surveying for tree of heaven, and then we offer to do the herbicide control on private properties. So we have growers or other property owners who have tree of heaven sign a permission slip They grant us access to their property. They allow us to use herbicide on their property. And as we've gone through this process over the past few years, we're gradually finding more sites. Of course, the more we look, the more we found. So it has become a larger project than I anticipated at first glance, but it's all good. And so we're at a point now where we're working with close to 20 different property owners across 30 different sites in the valley. We've treated close to 600 trees. We're actually going out, our team's going out this afternoon to treat a couple additional sites. So we've kind of just been gradually working at this over time now. And our intent is to control Tree of Heaven kind of in a wider radius outside of the valley and extend this control and these protections to the rest of our ag industry, particularly our fruit and nut growers too, as we go. So, we've made significant progress in Suisun Valley, and we're getting to a point where I think we feel like we have a pretty good buffer established and good control in the valley. So, I mean, it is one of the challenges. I think what I had, a long time through my career is that you just get overwhelmed by how much Tree of Heaven there is, but you need to start somewhere. And if you start at it and just kind of work at it gradually, then you can actually get somewhere. So how about I think I have one more slide here, Doug. So our go-to treatment to date has been using the EasyJect Lance tool with imazapyr and in some cases glyphosate. We've kind of experimented with both, but we're also doing cut stump treatments on smaller plants. And I know now, as a couple years have gone by and spotted lanternfly has become more widely known, and people are grasping the significant threat it poses to us here, that other areas are also encouraging this similar treatment strategy. The NRCS and Napa, Lodi Wine Commission, I know our colleagues up in Amador County Ag Department are doing similar work. The Placer County Ag Department recently worked with the Union Pacific Railroad in Roseville, which to clean up Tree of Heaven there. And Tree of Heaven, often you can imagine that rail yards and other disturbed areas like that are common places where you see Tree of Heaven. So, and that rail yard in Roseville is one of the biggest rail yards, maybe if not the biggest rail yard in the Western U.S. So that could be a likely point of introduction. So that's some good work over there in Placer County as well. And so with this, I think, very real threat of spotted lanternfly making its way to California, and this nexus to Tree of Heaven creates a real opportunity for us in the WMA community to take this proactive approach and work on our partnerships, build these partnerships between ag department or growers or grape growers, and all you folks in the WMA community and the Cal-IPC community to kind of build some more energy and to proactively control Tree of Heaven too. So most county ag departments now have a weed funding allocation. Now that said, and CDFA has encouraged us with our latest round of weed funding in the county ag departments to be proactive with Tree of Heaven, particularly for spotted lanternfly mitigation. But other ag departments may have other priority weed projects as too, but this is something that we could all work together on and team up on. I mean, I know we spend a lot of time doing surveys and getting the permission slips, sorted out. Doing the actual control work's pretty simple. One thing we have agreed upon with growers is that the ag department will come in and do the treatments, but we're going to leave you with a stand of dead trees or dead sticks. So it's on the property owner, at least in our case, to once the trees are dead, to go in and clean them up if they so choose.
Excellent. Thanks, Ed. That's fascinating about the rail yard being both a place where the egg masses could be introduced and a place where there's a lot of Tree of Heaven. So some interesting strategic thinking there. And given that the theme of the symposium is getting ahead of the invasion curve, and our kickoff session tomorrow is on prevention, it's a really good taste of the kind of things that we still don't have here that we really want to be working on prevention for. We have time for one question, and I see one in the chat that, or in the Q&A, wondering, it sounds like you're getting good cooperation from landowners, wondering if there's actually any funding through the wine grape industry or others.
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, there could be potentially, yeah, but not that I'm aware of at the moment.
Okay, great.
But
well,
the grape industry is become very aware of spotted lanternfly, and they're very concerned, and I think they have, are on board with projects like this. Yeah.
That's huge. Well, yeah, to be concerned before it gets here is the trick. So I'm glad that folks are paying attention. Okay. Well, thank you, Ed. Let's move to our second speaker on Tree of Heaven. Catherine Holmes is Deputy Executive Director of the Solano County RCD. So we've got a Solano County partnership going here with the Ag Commissioner's Office and the RCD. And Catherine is going to talk about how, in her experience, to actually control it. And Catherine has a lot of background in controlling woody species. Her PhD at UC Davis was on the impacts and control of edible fig in the Central Valley. So let's find Catherine down here and add her to the stage. There you are. Welcome, Catherine. And I'm going to add your presentation to the stage as well. And Yuta or Nikki, are you controlling this PowerPoint? I will assume yes. Or maybe Catherine, you are yourself.
I'm controlling it. Yes, I got it.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, Catherine. Welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for attending the statewide WMA. It's great to be here, and I'm happy always to talk about how to control Tree of Heaven. It's definitely been one of the big baddies in our restoration projects that Solano RCD implements throughout Solano County. A little bit of background, some of which Ed already talked about, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. Tree of Heaven is from China originally. It was introduced to this area of Northern California during the gold rush. In a restoration setting, particularly along riparian areas, Tree of Heaven has a tendency to form really dense colonies of many, many stems. So it can really exclude native vegetation. So it's a problematic invader along riparian areas. Tree of Heaven is known to be allelopathic. Its roots and leaf litter emits some sort of chemical that actually inhibits native plants from regenerating. And in fact, it's got all kinds of toxic compounds in it. One of the things that I found out when I was doing a lot of removal is that the sap is quite toxic to humans. And in fact, there have been folks that have cut down Tree of Heaven, live Tree of Heaven, gotten the sap in a wound and had severe heart inflammation that then requires hospitalization. So it's careful. You need to be careful around Tree of Heaven. That can be problematic. And then finally, as Ed talked about in great detail, Tree of Heaven is the preferred host plant for spotted lanternfly. So it's definitely an issue on many fronts. This is a tree we want to take care of and get rid of. So we've had a number of restoration projects where we had Tree of Heaven control efforts in Solano County. This picture here, you can see my coworker peering down at a very dense grove. Tree of Heaven, like I said, often turns clonal forms of dense grove, and it seems to really love steep slopes. So here we are trying to work on a slope that's probably steeper than even 1-to-1. It was pretty tough. We had to rappel down to do treatments. Tree of Heaven groves can contain trees of all sizes, from seedlings all the way up to something that's 1.5 feet in diameter. So they can be quite problematic when they are in that kind of a dense grove. I want to give you a few identification tips for Tree of Heaven because it actually can look somewhat like black walnut saplings when it's small. But there's a few ways to positively identify tree of heaven. The leaves, when they're crushed, have a disgusting rancid peanut butter smell. So for me, that's always a dead giveaway. But even if you don't have a good nose, you can look closely at the leaflets, and you'll see that tree of heaven leaflets have a little lobe. You can see in that circle that I've put here, a little lobe at the base of each leaflet where there's a small gland. So walnuts do not have that little lobe. They have more of a serrated edge, whereas tree of heaven has a smooth leaf margin with that little lobe. When you pull off a leaf, or if they fall naturally in the fall, they leave a U-shaped leaf trace, as is shown in this middle photo. So that's another positive way to identify tree of heaven. And finally, the bark is smooth and often occurs in groves. So that's one way to identify tree of heaven. When you're crawling around through riparian areas trying to treat tree of heaven, it's handy to have some ways to identify it positively from similarly looking native trees. All right, I'm going to start by mentioning a couple of things that I found did not work in controlling tree of heaven. When I first started working on tree of heaven, we tried hack and squirt. And so this is a photo from that effort where we cut overlapping cuts all around the circumference of the bark of tree of heaven and then filled those cuts with glyphosate. We also tried cut stump, where we would cut the tree down and then paint the stump with Garland 4. Both of these methods actually kills, I'm going to call it the mother tree, pretty well, but it stimulates an emergency response. Both hack and squirt and cut stump will stimulate an emergency response, and you will have dozens, hundreds, even thousands of root sprouts spring up from a tree when you take either of these approaches to them, particularly if the tree is large. This is literally a recipe for creating dense groves of tree of heaven. I strongly recommend that you don't do this. It would probably be better to leave a large single tree standing than to do hack and squirt on it and walk away and never look back, because instead of one tree, you'll end up with hundreds of trees. So this was a mistake that I made initially, but we don't do this approach anymore to controlling tree of heaven. Instead, just like Ed mentioned, we use the EasyJect lance. So I'm going to briefly cover what this EasyJect lance is all about. And it'll sound like I'm a salesperson for the company. I'm not, but I do think it's a great product. The EasyJect lance we use on all tree of heaven over about 1.5 inches in diameter. As you can see in the smaller photo, there are cartridges. They're basically a 22 shell that they fill with gelled herbicide. So we buy the Amazepir cartridges. It comes in a plastic tube, and you basically load the back end here in this smaller picture. You can see the end of the EasyJect lance. It has 4 basically long tubes that you can fill with these cartridges. And in fact, you can put about 400 of them in an EasyJect lance. So you can work all day with one filling of the cartridges. So then we go out and we use the EasyJect lance on every sizable tree of heaven tree we find, and we inject a cartridge every 4 inches all the way around the trunk. And this gelled herbicide, the tree sap rises up into the cartridge, mixes with the herbicide, and then it's a systemic herbicide, so it then travels all throughout the tree. So this kills the tree without causing root sprouting. So it's a way to get the herbicide in without alarming the mother tree. I like it also because there's minimal herbicide exposure to the operator or the environment. Everything's encapsulated, so we use this technique in open space areas that the public is present in. It feels very safe. I will say that EasyJect lance and the cartridges there's no gunpowder involved, and so it's all arm work. This is basically just a way to poke something into a tree, but you're the one doing all of the push. So it kind of puts you at risk of tennis elbow. You want to sort of spread out your tree of heaven control days over several weeks. The lance does cost about $700, so it's not cheap, but I think it's really worth it. And then, of course, you have to buy the cartridges. The cartridges are available both with Amazepir and glyphosate, we tend to use the imazapyr because tree of heaven is hard to kill. When I was hunting around looking for current prices for the lance, I did see that several companies are no longer selling imazapyr cartridges to California. So I was pretty bummed to see that. So hopefully this is a tool that remains available for Californians to use on tree of heaven and other problematic woody species. But I'm not sure what was going on with that. I thought I'd just mention it. If you want one, buy it soon, because there are still a few companies that are selling them to us. I want to mention that the lance does require regular maintenance, and there are some directions online, videos that you can use to learn how to maintain the lance. Here's the parts chart that the company has available, so you can see it's fairly complicated. All of the different little internal parts. You do occasionally need to replace some of those parts, so luckily you can purchase them separately. And finally, I have a little tip for y'all. Don't store the cartridges in the lance. When you go out and do treatment, at the end of the day, if you have cartridges left over, take and put them back into the little plastic tube that they are transported in. If you leave them in the lance, occasionally that gelled herbicide leaks out of the cartridge, and you don't want to have a bunch of gelled herbicide gunking up all those little parts that are inside your lance. We do still treat tree of heaven saplings under 1.5 inches with cut stump. You just can't use a lance on a sapling that's too small, because it takes pressure to push that bullet into the trunk. So we use a cut stump method where we lop off the sapling or seedling, and we use either, my coworker here has got a low pressure spray bottle or a buckthorn blaster. Either of those two methods allow us to disperse the herbicide in a controlled manner onto a small surface. We use a 10% imazapyr, 50% glyphosate solution for our cut stump. Works well on small isolated stems, but once again, I want to emphasize it does not work on large tree of heaven. You really want to minimize this treatment approach to just the stems that are too small to use the Easy Ject lance on. Last couple slides, I want to point out that biomass removal is actually a huge part of tree of heaven control. Tree of heaven grows quickly, and that means that once it's dead, its wood is very brittle. It's brittle within a year after death, and this can pose a serious hazard to park visitors, open space visitors, drivers along a road, if you were controlling tree of heaven along a road. I had an alarming situation where we killed some large 18-inch DBH tree of heaven near a road. And within a year, they had fallen and were leaning against a power line over the road. So we had to do an emergency hiring of a tree company to come and take the dead tree of heaven down before it fell, broke a power line, and landed on a road. So definitely don't start tree of heaven control without an exit plan. And it's far more expensive, by the way, to cut down and dispose of the biomass than it is to walk around and use herbicide on the trunks. So that has to be a substantial part of your financial planning of tree of heaven control, is in fact the removal of the biomass. Even after the trees fall or are felled, the biomass is so great that it can prevent natural regeneration. I had a 1-acre site where we removed 200 cubic yards of biomass afterwards. This was a site that park rangers had tried to use cut stump methods to control the tree of heaven. Didn't work, caused clonal regrowth and root resprouting, and definitely was a big problem. So it's best to plan to take multiple years to kill a really large grove, and you need multiple years of funding. One thing I want to mention, that we were talking about funding options, so I quickly added this to my slide. Natural Resources Conservation Service works with growers to implement resource conservation programs, and their EQIP program does have funding for tree of heaven control. It's a brush removal. Let's see, I wrote it down. Conservation Practice 314 for brush management will cover the cost for growers, vineyard owners, to apply herbicide as well as cut and remove the vegetation. So for folks that are working with agricultural producers. Keep in mind that those agricultural producers can apply for NRCS funding, and there is a practice that would allow Tree of Heaven control. I think that's about it. Lessons learned. Quick recap here. Don't use hack and squirt or cut stump on large Tree of Heaven trees. Consider investing in an EasyJect lance and learn how to maintain it. Imazapyr should always be used with caution. I'm sure all of you know about the dead zones that can occur around use of Imazapyr. I think it has to be used with great caution, but Tree of Heaven is a candidate for Imazapyr use, in my opinion, particularly when using the EasyJect lance, where you're using tiny amounts of herbicide, truly small amounts of herbicide, very effectively. And then final thing, don't start a Tree of Heaven control program without multiple years of funding and a solid exit strategy. You don't want to be the one calling the tree company and begging them to come take down a ginormous Tree of Heaven as it leans against a power line. That was one of the worst feelings in my life. So anyway, just a few tips there. And with that, I'm done.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. So yeah, a couple questions from the Q&A line. One is, do you know of a biocontrol agent available? Dave Bakke is saying he thought that he had heard that one was approved. Anything you know about?
Yeah, I don't know anything about that, but that would be great because it is all over. Not only is it, on edges of agricultural lands and vineyards, but it's deep in riparian areas. So
where it's so hard to get to, yeah.
Where it's hard to get to, yeah.
And then I know we talked about this, but Dan Lubin from State Park says that he's had success in basil bark treatment with Garlon and oil. But it sounded like your experience with basil bark was that it wasn't working.
Yeah, I've done a lot of basil bark treatment, and I have not found it to work very well with Tree of Heaven. The other thing that you have to be careful with of basil bark, in dense groves, it is very easy to go off label on the maximum use rate. So basil bark, you're usually applying herbicide at a 25% concentration, 75% seed oil, methylated seed oil, and you end up using a lot on a per area basis. So you got to be careful if you're treating a grove. But more to the point, I actually didn't find that it worked very well with Tree of Heaven. I think the bark was just a little too thick. I would encourage folks to try the EasyJect. I know Miles DePrado with UC Davis does a sort of low-tech version of EasyJect lance. He actually goes just out with a drill driver and a squirt bottle with Imazapyr in it, and he drills little holes around the tree and then uses a squirt bottle to fill the holes. So even if you're feeling like a $700 lance is too much for an investment, I really do think you use less herbicide with this approach than you would with basil bark. Basil bark uses a lot of herbicide.
Got it. And when you've got the multi-stem, multi-trunk jobber, are you using the EasyJect to go in every 4 inches into every stem, or can you get away with just doing some and have it systemically kill the tree?
It's a mix. I think it's best if you can do it in every stem. Sometimes that just doesn't work that way, and so you do the best you can. I will say the EasyJect lance comes in 3 different handle lengths. We have the longer, or maybe we have the mid-length handle. You can get a short one that's just about 2 feet, 1.5 feet long, that would allow you to be more maneuverable in dense stands. So that's something to consider if folks really, of course, you'd have to refill it more often with the cartridges, but it's really easy to fill the cartridges. So getting the smaller one would allow you to work in a dense grove a little bit better than I think our handle's probably 3.5 feet long. Got it.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like it's also less messy procedure since you've got the herbicide contained in capsules.
Yeah, it's not messy at all. It's really, I think it's if only there was a little gunpowder mixed in so you didn't have a tennis elbow from using it. But it really, I feel good using it because it's very safe for the applicator, and you just use a tiny amount of herbicide and it's so crazy effective. So. Nice.
Well, and it sounds like it doesn't visually alarm people in the same way that spraying something would. So very good. Well, thank you so much. And the tip about the NRCS conservation measure that could potentially fund this through EQIP, that's golden too. Really appreciate that information.
You're welcome.
All right. Thanks, Catherine. Well, so next up, we are going to shift away from Tree of Heaven, and we are going to talk about, actually, I think we want Patrick. I think we're starting from the far north. Thank you. To talk about the geranium lucidum. We're going to talk about 3 plants that are relatively new to California. Geranium lucidum in the far north, shiny geranium. Voluteria tubuliflora, desert knapweed in the far south, and then garlic mustard, which is found both in the far north and the far south. So we'll start off with shiny geranium, and Patrick Hoffman from the Humboldt County Department of Ag Weights and Measures. Hi,
everyone. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Doug. Yeah, like Doug said, I'm here to talk about shiny geranium in my region of the state. I am with the County Ag Department, and I'm co-chair of the Humboldt Weed Management Area. I'm going to first kind of go through, the concerns with this weed and when it showed up in the state and my region, and quickly show you how to identify this, and then I will tell you what we're doing to control this and what other weed management area members in my region are doing to try to control this weed. So what's the concern? Why is this a problem? It is a CDFA A-rated weed. It's a Cal-IPC watch. It is more widespread in Oregon and Washington. It actually first showed up in Oregon, the northern part of the state, in I think a pasture in the 70s, and it spread from there. So it's proven to be very invasive in Oregon and Washington. It shows up in forests and park roadsides, especially. The big concern in Oregon has been its ability to invade oak woodlands. So that's also going to be a concern for us here, likely. And then it spreads through explosive dispersal from capsules, which is typical of geraniums. Very small seeds. They likely move around on animals and vehicles. The seed bank persists for more than a year. And in Washington, the spread has been linked to contaminated nursery stock. So that's something to watch out for. It's really easy one to miss when it's small. In California, it first showed up in the state in Strawberry Canyon behind UC Berkeley in 1998. And judging from CalFlora and iNaturalist observations, it's still in that area, and it's spread locally, maybe to some other parts of Berkeley too. It's also in the South Bay and on the peninsula, also, going off of iNaturalist and CalFlora observations. It's in a few places in those counties. I've looked at all the iNaturalist observations. A lot of them seem accurate. So, I feel decently confident that they're actually there. It first showed up, though, on the North Coast, as far as I'm aware, in 2011. And it spread south kind of along the 101 corridor. It showed up in my county, Humboldt County, in 2013, and then it was in Mendocino by 2022. It's also present in, I kind of already went to this, but San Mateo, Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, and then all the way down in San Diego counties. I saw an observation online that really looks like shiny geranium, so I tend to believe it. There are also iNaturalist observations in LA County, but I think they're misidentifications, at least what's there. So I think this is likely a lot more widespread, at least for the sites I'm aware of in our county. They're pretty disjunct. So it's not like they're all in a region, or you can easily see like how this got from here to there. Other than sites spreading along 101, other sites pop up in a random residential neighborhood, or along pasture land off some far-flung county road. So I think there's probably sites that we've missed, and it's a small herbaceous plant. It can be easy to miss. Let's see. Going back, I forgot to point out that the picture on the right there, that's from Lane County, Oregon, and you can see all that shiny geranium on the forest floor there. So that's what we don't want to happen here. And it's not to that point yet. So identification, it has these, fairly small 5-petaled flowers. They come in pairs on green or red stems. You can see at the top here, these 2 flowers coming off together, or on the right-hand side, these 2 here. It has long pointed capsules, which is typical of geraniums. That's why they also have the common name crane's bills. I've read that it can be biennial. I've only observed it as an annual. So the sites I've been to, it's not surviving year round, but apparently it can. What I've seen where we treat this weed, I kind of put a little timeline here of what it looks like during most years. It sprouts in late fall or winter, flowers by April, and then begins going to seed in May. And at our locations, it's typically dead. It's died back by mid to late summer. If you go out, looking for this in late summer or fall, it can be really hard to find it. Sometimes, if there's other vegetation, you're not even going to know that this was present, depending on how dense the population was. And then this can, this timeline varies year to year. Sometimes we see it a little later, and I think in different regions, you see a little bit of a different timeline here. It can be confused with other geraniums. I think pretty often I see people confusing it with dovefoot geranium, which is another non-native geranium that's already much more widespread. And I'm gonna, on my next slide here, I'm gonna show you a comparison, but usually the shininess, this leaf at the top here is wet, obviously, but usually that shininess really stands out most of the time, at least. So disclaimer on this slide, I did steal it from another presentation, but I cannot figure out where I took it from, so I wasn't able to credit it. Hopefully whoever created it does not mind. But I really like this slide because it shows a comparison of the shiny geranium and the dove's foot geranium. On that middle photo there, you can see that shiny geranium often has these really red or magenta stems. You don't see that with the dove's foot geranium over here. It's not always the case that the stems are red. They seem to usually start off green. They're green like other geraniums in the spring, and as they flower, it gets later into the season, they turn more red. Although I do sometimes see red on the stems, even in early spring, but typically they're mostly green at that time. So the red's not super reliable. I'll also say that in these photos, this is kind of like the ideal image of the dove's foot geranium and the shiny geranium. And they can sometimes look a little more like each other than they do here. So it can be easy to confuse them. What usually stands out to me, like kind of the most reliable trait, I think, for telling these two apart, is to look at the venation. On the dove's foot, it's sunken. It's always this kind of sunken venation, and I never see that on the shiny geranium. You can see the venation on the shiny geranium, but it's not sunken into the leaf. It's kind of a smooth leaf surface. Then the next thing I look for is the shininess of the leaves, but you'll also see that the dove's foot is really fuzzy. The shiny looks smoother with fewer hairs, although it does have these kind of sparse, like trichome structures on the leaf. Another thing I've noticed is that shiny geranium often has this kind of U shape here. Definitely not always the case, but often you see that. And with this geranium, with dove's foot geranium and a lot of like similar looking geraniums, it's typically more of a V here. Not super reliable, but along with other traits, that's something that I found to be helpful when trying to identify these plants or tell them apart. On the right hand, you'll see a photo of an inland site.
Patrick, this is Doug, just butting in. We need to keep moving, so because we've got a couple other to fit in this half-hour session. So if you can, okay. I don't know how close you are, but
yeah,
go at pace.
I'm going to go into what my department's doing to control this and what other local WMA members are doing. Our county is really herbicide adverse, so my department uses herbicide as kind of our last option. So far we've only been hand pulling these sites. We have 2 sites where we've been consistently hand pulling for 3 years now. We begin hand pulling in February, and we usually have to go back 2 to 3 times to look for mist or late emerging plants. At one site where it's along a shady roadside, we've seen about a 50% reduction in the footprint of the infested area over these 3 years of hand pulling. And then, we didn't measure the density of the plants within that kind of footprint of infested area, but visually it's a really obvious reduction. Whereas another site where there's more sun, also a roadside site, really haven't seen a reduction in the overall area, although it does seem like the plants are a little patchier. Other interesting thing is we've seen so this is adjacent to a pasture. There is Himalayan blackberry all along the fence line, and I don't see it extending under the Himalayan blackberry, or very rarely. So it seems to kind of stop with that blackberry. But hand pulling doesn't seem to be working at site 2, maybe working at site 1. I think part of the issue here may be, or I'm just guessing, that site 2 is sunnier, has a lot more vegetation, competing vegetation. So when you get the easy, dense populations pulled here, it's really hard to find these few remaining plants that are hiding in the other vegetation, and it can go to seed when they're really small. Found 4 more sites in 2024, so they're showing up, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Caltrans, north of us, they do an annual application of Garlon. They haven't eliminated any populations this way, but they've all been greatly reduced, and they go back and kind of, after the applications, hand pull a few remaining plants, I believe. And then at their sites in Humboldt County, they've been doing mulching with wood chips and hand pulling. The mulching works really great at really reducing the population, but then they're going back 1 to 2 visits monthly to hand pull the rest of the plants of those sites. State Parks uses Roundup or Milestone, depending on the area. Let's see, National Park Service was originally treating hand pulling only, but that was very labor intensive. It is really labor intensive to hand pull. So they moved to doing Milestone, followed later in the season with hand pulling at sites. The sites that we're treating now, they were hand pulled by a local organization called RCAA at least 1 season, maybe more, but they had issues with the mowing schedule for these roadside sites, and I believe they missed some seasons of hand pulling. So they've been reliably pulled annually since 2022, but beforehand it was kind of they weren't fully getting those sites. So my takeaways here, got this quote: once fully established, geranium lucidum is virtually impossible to eliminate from a site due to its rapid rate of increase, high plant density, and persistent seed bank. Difficulty of implementing management treatments without causing collateral damage to associated native herbaceous plants. Well, it is difficult. So what I've heard from other organizations treating locally is that they haven't been able to eliminate any sites. Manual removal is really labor intensive, really takes a lot of time. Haven't been able to eliminate sites that way. Herbicide use is a lot quicker, a lot easier, but even those sites where herbicide use has been occurring consistently, geranium is still showing up at low levels, and they're having to return year after year to these sites. We haven't eradicated it from any location since it showed up in our region. And I think this just highlights the importance of EDRR. So early detection, rapid response. You got to find this when populations are really small, so you have a chance of eliminating them. I'm generally finding these when they're already fairly large, and I think it's just because this is this small herbaceous plant that's easily overlooked. And it does well in gardens. It does well on roadsides. And one of the newer sites, I'm seeing it spread up into kind of a oak, Doug fir forested area from a roadside. So, we're still in the early stages of invasion. I think it's probably still early stages in other regions of the state where it has shown up, but this is one to look out for. Again, it's been really a challenge for land managers in Oregon and Washington to control this.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Definitely one for us all to keep an eye on, and it does bring up for like Paul Heipel here in the Bay Area that Geranium purpureum is kind of doing similar things. So tough things to get on top of. We'll stay posted on how it goes up there in Humboldt, Del Norte, and Mendocino, and hopefully we can get a handle on it so it doesn't spread. And good to know about the Bay Area populations, which I didn't know about until you mentioned them, and even the San Diego record. We'll have to check into that as well. So thanks very much. I think we need to go on to the garlic mustard talks. Thanks for being here, Patrick. Greatly appreciate it. So yeah, Jim and Chris McDonald. I don't know if one of you are you going first, Jim?
I thought Chris was going to go first.
Okay, so let's put his presentation up and get him on stage as well, if we can. Hey, Chris.
Hi, Doug.
How's it going? So yeah, we'll get you guys both up here, and you can tag team and tell us about garlic mustard, both in the South and the North.
All right, so I'm going to cover garlic mustard and a little bit of garlic mustard biology, so then Jim doesn't have to, and you don't have to hear the same thing twice. So next slide. So garlic mustard, Alliaria petiolata, is a well-established weed in the eastern U.S. You can see it on the iNaturalist map here, really hot all along the eastern coast into the Appalachians and even into the Midwest. It is a relatively unusual weed in the southwestern U.S. The closest infestations to us in California are in the Pacific Northwest, Utah, and Colorado. Next slide. Garlic mustard's a somewhat unusual weed. It is an obligate cool season biennial. So what we mean by that is it germinates in the fall or winter, usually not when there's snow on the ground, so in the late fall or late winter. And then it produces a rosette in the first year. It does not flower in the first year. It then flowers in the second year, and then those plants die in the second year. Plants don't live a third year. Next slide. The seeds also need cold stratification, so they need to have a cold enough winter for a long enough time. So the basic story on that is it doesn't grow in areas with warm winters. Unfortunately for us, the seed bank is 10 plus years, so budget and project duration is going to be a really big challenge with this species. The plants germinate after the first rains in the fall to the winter. Fewer germinate later in the spring. This plant is very shade tolerant. You can find it under dense litter through canopies. And in Southern California, it grows in riparian areas. The second year plants begin to bolt from about April to May. The flowering starts in May to June, and the fruiting season is May to July. The pulling season ends somewhere in June, occasionally in early July when the fruits begin to dry out and those seeds start to pop off of the stems, and then it just creates problems with trying to do containment. So our pulling season for this plant is relatively short, just a couple of months to try and get it all done. Next slide. Garlic mustard, I forgot to mention, garlic mustard is an A-rated weed by CDFA. The plant size can be variable from at flowering. It can be 6 inches tall, or it can be 5 feet tall. So when you're crawling through the forest floor, it is really difficult to try and be looking for these tiny little plants that are growing through a whole bunch of just huge monster-sized plants. It's crazy variable. Next slide. Jim's going to be talking about our population in Northern California and Trinity. There are 2 other reports in California, one in Marin, that's pretty recently, and one in Napa, that's a few years old. I'll be talking about the population down in San Bernardino. Next slide. So the population in San Bernardino is right north of the city of San Bernardino or Riverside. For those of you who don't know where that is in Southern California, we're up in the San Bernardino Mountains. This was the first known invasion in California. It was first reported in 2020 by Duncan Bell, who works at the California Botanic Gardens, and he was out doing a floristic survey that was sponsored by the U.S. Forest Service. Soon after, they started scouting, and they found it along 2.5 miles of creek in the Hook Creek watershed. Several of the adjacent watersheds have been surveyed, and we haven't found any garlic mustard in those watersheds. But it was well established when it was discovered with hundreds of populations. Next slide. We've had several challenges with managing this species. About 1/3 of that 2.5 mile length of infestation is on private property. So we're dealing with a lot of homeowners who have this in their backyards. And then about 2/3 of that length is on Forest Service land. And for this specific location, the Forest Service does not have a NEPA for herbicide use. And because all of these locations are riparian and most are also aquatic, as you can see in this picture, it's growing right next to the creek. We're using hand pulling only for all locations. It's really slow and tedious. And it requires multiple passes each year per site. And that's because the plants easily snap at the soil surface. They have this S-shaped root. So if you don't pull the whole root out of the ground, the plant will resprout and then reflower, and you got to go back every few weeks throughout the pulling season, which is only a few months long. Next slide. Our pulling efforts started mostly in 2021 with a few limited efforts after we did some scouting. Then in 2022, we finally started to get to a good pulling effort underway. We pulled on private property and the easiest access areas of the Forest Service. And these were about the 50 to 100 largest populations. So we kind of got lucky that the largest areas to pull are also the easiest access. In 2023, we started to ramp up our pulling efforts as well to include nearly all of the private lands. But that extra work that we did on the Forest Service lands basically went to pulling more plants at new sites because we had extra rain. And we still had gaps in our surveys and our pulling efforts. And part of that is we just keep running out of time at the end of the season to try and get all these plants pulled. Next slide. In late 2023, we were able to successfully obtain funding from CDFA through the WMA funds, but also the San Bernardino County Ag Commissioner had some funding and the North National Forest Foundation. So we were able to hire 2 additional crews in 2024 pulling season to pull the entire Forest Service stretch. And that was through the help of the Inland Empire Resource Conservation District and through WRA. This increased pulling included all plants, not just the flowering plants, which we had been pulling earlier, but we were also pulling those first-year rosettes, which means we're buying time for the 2025 pulling season. So hopefully we can really get ahead of this. And this was the first time our pulling effort included the whole length of the infestation. So we've really been making some progress on a few populations, and a couple even had no new plants in 2024, so that's good news. But we still have hundreds left to extirpate. Next slide. So just looking at a comparison between the end of the season in 2023 versus 2024, 2023 on the left, you can see there's a big gap in the middle of the area where it's really difficult terrain to get into. And with that extra funding in 2024, we were able to close in that gap. So it was really great to have that area knocked out. Next slide. So this has been a huge team to do this. We've had partners in the Forest Service, with the Urban Conservation Corps, San Bernardino County Ag Weights and Measures, Inland Empire Resource Conservation District, WMA, WRA, and myself. So it's been a huge effort to try and get this going. And we're going to be out there for a very long time, and I hope we get this under control. So thank you all for being here. Next slide is my last slide. And Jim, you can take it away and tell us more about Trinity.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was impressive. Glad to know you're getting on top of the population down there with some funding and lots of collaboration. So from Chris with Cooperative Extension in the south to Jim Belcher with the Shasta Trinity National Forest, forest botanist in the north.
All right, thank you. So I will, I think I'll be able to move through some of these slides a little faster, thanks to Chris's presentation. So again, here's the a recent map of the North American distribution. So you can see up in Oregon, it is known in Southern Oregon, and I'm going to talk about here in Trinity County. So this was discovered along Rush Creek just a couple years ago. This is our field crew of Bryce Rawls and Michaela Wood. So they were out doing project surveys, just trying to figure out what everything is out there on the ground, and came to an unknown. And luckily we had another botanist on the crew, Alex Ebert, who was from the East and said, oh no, I think I know what that is, unfortunately. And yes, it turned out to be garlic mustard. So here's a couple of our current infestations. So we went out in July, which, as we discovered, was a little too late. But our WMA, we had a meeting. We went out there in July, had representatives from Yurok Tribal Fisheries, the Forest Service, Safe Alternatives for our forest environment, Trinity County Natural Resource Division, Trinity County Ag Department, BLM, and the Watershed Research and Training Center, and Native Ecosystem. So a good broad representation of WMA members went out there. We did some initial talking about what the problem was, looking at the maps, and slide. So one of the members had even spent about, or a few, him and a few of his people spent about 9 hours of volunteer time just trying to start pulling and trying to assess how long this was going to take. There's a couple of their piles. So this is what we have mapped so far. So if you know the area, here's Weaverville down here, Trinity Alps Wilderness up here, Trinity Lake. So this is the main stem of the Trinity River. So really at this point, we're very early in this. So we're going to try to figure out exactly how far down the river or Rush Creek it is. Goals to keep it out of the Trinity River. And we were successful. We have some mapping and implementation money from bill funds that are going through the National Forest Foundation. And they are just about ready to approve a contract with a local group to do this mapping and initial treatments. Then, oh, I thought I had one more slide. I guess I don't. So anyway, I think I will sum it up there, unless there's any questions for me.
Well, that's great, Jim. Again, really good to see the amount of collaboration and the fact that you've been able to get some funding as well. Quick question, this one coming in from Elena Rich. If you were, Chris, if you're allowed to use herbicide, which herbicide and treatment would you choose? And do you think that might make things more effective or not?
It would definitely speed things up if we were able to use herbicide, but since we're so close to water, it would have to be an aquatically approved herbicide. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, since we're dealing with private property, we'd have to get permission from every single property owner to spray on their property, which just turns into a logistical nightmare. So it's easier to hand pull on the private properties than to try and get all of the permissions.
And on the national forest property, it's not allowed through their NEPA?
Yeah, it's just going to take a couple of years to get a NEPA to go through. So we're currently kind of stuck for right now.
Okay. And what problems does garlic mustard pose? Why are we concerned about it?
At least in the back east, it really forms a dense carpet underneath on the riparian forest floor. And there's a couple of studies that show that it can actually grow so dense that it shades out tree seedlings, to where you can get some of the tree seedlings dying on the forest floor, and then you don't get that regeneration coming through as new holes in the canopy are created. So it's a really competitive little weed.
Got it. Well, Jim, a question for you. Do you have any theories as to how the Trinity County populations got there in such a remote location?
Our speculation was when we were out there. So here, there is a lot of private land adjacent to the creek. And speculation is that it came from a garden. It is quick online queries. You can find people that are willing to sell you seeds or plants. It's known for people use it culinary purposes, and I guess there are some medicinal purposes.
Yeah, I guess garlic mustard sounds like something you might find at Trader Joe's. So yeah.
Yeah, right. So that's our guess, is that it came in from somebody's garden.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much for the update on that. That sounds like something we all need to be looking for, especially in our riparian areas. Thanks for the coordinated work you're both doing in your respective areas to keep that from spreading downstream. Thanks so much for being here. Chris, you're going to stick with us to talk about our final of the three newish plants to the state, Volutaria. Take it away.
All right. Thanks, Doug. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about desert knapweed, or Volutaria, depending on what you want to call it, in Southern California. Next slide. So Volutaria is kind of interesting. This is the first known population in North America, but yet we have multiple sites of it in Southern California. So we're kind of on three different points on the invasion curve. In Borrego Springs, we're at containment. Newport and San Diego, we're at eradication. And basically everywhere else in the region, we're at prevention. Next. So Volutaria tubuliflora, scientific name. It was first reported in Upper Newport Bay. That's the green star on the upper left in the map there, in 1987. It's also found in Borrego Springs. That's out in the desert by the backside of San Diego County. And also it's found in Chula Vista, which is basically right near San Diego. That 1987 population wasn't vouchered until 2003, but at least in the specimen notes that it is mentioned that it was being seen in 1987. So we do have a good idea that it's been at least at Newport for a fairly long time. Next slide. But nobody knew that this was hiding in an herbarium. So in late 2010, a pair of botanists out in Anza Borrego Desert State Park, which is in Borrego Springs, saw an unusual plant that wasn't in bloom. And when they came out later in the season, the plant was missing. So they didn't have any photos. They didn't have a voucher of it. And that was R.T. Hawk and Tom Chester. So we have this kind of second first contact. Next slide. Then we have this third first known contact where Anza Borrego Desert State Park staff called me out to see this unusual plant growing like a weed in a different location, Borrego Springs, and none of us had known about RT and Tom's collection of the plant in the northern part of this Borrego at Alcoholic Pass. Next slide. So this is kind of a map of Borrego Springs. The two populations on the bottom were where Anza Borrego Desert State Park staff vouchered the locations in 2011. The star up top is Alcoholic Pass. Those are about 10 miles apart. But every year since 2011, we've been finding new populations scattered basically between those two sites. Next slide. Skipping ahead a couple of years here, by 2015, that's when our mapping efforts started to get really on top of it. And we had found several dozen populations in Borrego Springs by then. Next slide. Then in late 2014, the Orange County California Native Plant Society volunteers had discovered another unusual plant growing in the Upper Newport Bay Preserve, right near the 1987 location that nobody had known about. And this was probably the fourth new discovery of this species. In 2015, they made specimen vouchers and were able to identify it as a Volutaria. Next slide. In 2016, things finally started to come together across the different sites. The pulling effort in Newport Bay was well established, and we had pulled several thousand plants by hand in and around Upper Newport Bay. The pulling effort was ramping up in Borrego Springs, and like I mentioned earlier, we had starting to get really good maps of the infestations, where we had found several dozen populations. A new population of Volutaria was found in Chula Vista near San Diego by Jesse Vinge, and that was about 60 miles away from Borrego Springs. So also we learned that in 2016 that Volutaria has the ability to spread far, but has also remained relatively stable in Newport for 30 years, occupying about the same areas. Next slide. So in 2016, we had this unusual kind of triangle of infestations in Newport, Borrego Springs, and Chula Vista. And this triangle will pop up in several more slides as well. Next slide. So skipping ahead again to 2023 here, we had found tens of thousands of plants in Borrego Springs. It's a really large infestation, and the population is growing and expanding in Borrego Springs, creeping on the south and west side of town. There is also a new population found in Ramona, and there is also a new population found at the Rancho Hamul Ecological Reserve, which will be a presentation on later at the symposium. Next slide. And then in 2023 as well, roadside sites were found in Riverside County, in Oasis, and between Thermal and Mecca, creeping into the Coachella Valley. Next slide. So one of the lessons that we've learned is that after pulling it for 6 good years in Orange County, we still have not gotten rid of it in Newport. You can see the CalFlora map on the left on 2017, and you can look at the map on the right in 2023. Most of the populations that were hot, or the subpopulations that were hot in 2017 are still hot in 2023. So it's taken a lot of effort to get this plant under control. Next slide. However, the difference between 2023 and 2024 could not be more stark. It was in 2024, even though we had good rains in Southern California, it was just a very light year compared to years past. So is the seed bank finally depleted after 7 years? Was it just an off year? We'll find out as soon as it rains in November and December. So keeping our fingers crossed on that one. Next slide. Skipping back over to Borrego Springs, I've got that green bar on the map on the left to kind of give you a 10-mile scale. And you can see that there are populations with indicated by the blue arrows as where it keeps spreading from 2022 to 2023 to 2024. So we're just constantly finding more new plants in known areas and also outside of areas that we had previously surveyed. Next slide. So what's really interesting about this, I mentioned that triangle earlier, that triangle of the first 3 known infestations. Most of our new sites in 2023 and 2024 have been within those 3 populations between Newport, Borrego Springs, and Chula Vista. There's been less movement outside of the area, and maybe that's just because people who are accidentally spreading it in Borrego Springs or Chula Vista also live in the inland parts of the area. But we're still kind of waiting for it to pop up outside of that triangle as it spreads more regionally, because we know it has the capacity to spread really far very quickly. Next slide. So again, we're waiting for it. Like, is it going to show up on the Colorado River? Is it going to show up in Phoenix or Yuma or somewhere along there? It's going to show up in LA. It grows along the coast really well. It grows in the desert really well. It has just a wide habitat range. It should be able to spread across much of Southern California. Next slide. We have learned along the way that aminopyrrolid controls it very well as a pre and a post-emergent. Glyphosate also works very well, and roadside spraying crews have been able to suppress population as well as spot spraying as well. And hand pulling this weed anytime before late flowering also works well. It actually holds on to its seeds decently well, so it's one of those things that you can pull it and it doesn't scatter its seeds too much in the early part of the flowering season. So our problem really hasn't been in controlling individual plants. It's been either containing the spread in Borrego Springs, because it's spread out over a 10 to 15 mile area, or just the amount of years that it takes to eradicate the oldest populations, as we're learning in Newport Bay as we keep going back every year and there's still plants there. Next slide. Most of our populations are under some sort of management. In Newport, Hamul, Chula Vista, Cedar Creek with the Forest Service site, and the Bonsall site, those are all under eradication. So we've got a good handle on this. But in Borrego Springs, it's just a huge site. And so we're really trying to focus on containment down there and keep it from spreading everywhere else. So hopefully we can get that stayed contained. Next slide. I do want to point out that this species is doing the exact same thing in Chile. It is next to the coast, and it is in the Atacama Desert as well. It's spread along about a 200-mile stretch of central Chile, north of Santiago. And Chile receives much less rainfall than California. So the fact that it's growing well in Borrego Springs on a few inches of rain, it could probably grow on even less rain if it makes it out to somewhere like El Centro. Next slide. And these are a couple of pictures I scraped from iNaturalist. And if you didn't know this wasn't Southern California, you could be tricked, because these pictures of Voluteria in Chile look just like Voluteria in Southern California, whether it's on the desert on the left or a roadside site in the middle or something more coastal on the very right picture as well. Next slide. And this Voluteria was also a team effort. We've had hundreds of people working on this plant, and I hope that we can eradicate many of the populations that it's spread to soon. And there's my email address, and thank you all for being here.
Thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciate all the work that you've done on this, and that the San Diego County Department of Ag and Weights and Measures has been doing on it, and Joe Woods and state parks and all sorts of folks. I'll repeat the question from Garlic Mustard. Why do we care about Voluteria? What's the potential impact?
So Voluteria looks like it is not habitat for much of anything. It doesn't have a lot of pollinators on it. It doesn't seem like it's good forage for desert animals, wildlife. It also grows in relatively thick patches in the desert, but also in the coastal areas. So it can suppress other weeds as well. It has a really, not that I want anyone to eat it, but if you've accidentally pulled garlic mustard, Voluteria with your bare hands and then eaten your lunch several hours later, your fingers have a really bitter taste. It's awful. So it probably has some sort of nasty chemicals in it that is just not good for all sorts of things.
Got it. Well, and seeing how densely it can grow out there in Borrego Springs, where it does seem to spread more than it has in Newport Bay, that definitely gives us concern about it spreading across the Southwest and further into the desert.
Yeah, and like I said, it grows really well in Chile, which has less rain than California. It should be able to spread across much of the southwestern U.S.
Excellent. Well, not excellent.
Excellent in a bad way.
Thanks for the news, and thanks for the work. I guess one of the themes of this portion of the session is that we are able to get on things a bit earlier. It's a little sobering to hear that in 2011 we knew it was in Borrego Springs, but I think our ability to communicate about these things is improving, and hopefully we can contain and eradicate where possible, for sure. All right. Well, thank you, Chris. As we move on to Trevor and David, if we can bring them on screen, I will mention that the recordings are, so the presentations in PDF mode, the PowerPoints, the slides, are available on the WebEx webpage under details if you scroll down. Also, the recordings of these sessions will be posted once they're processed back on the session on WebEx. So if you come in later, it'll probably take it half an hour to process, it will be here for the duration of the symposium. And then after the symposium's over, we will work on them on the back end and post them on our website. Generally takes us a few months to do that. So the time to catch them is during the symposium and maybe a few days after. All right. Well, so next up, thrilled to welcome David Kratville and Trevor Fox from the California Department of Food and Agriculture to give us an update on the program from CDFA. Looks like we need to share their presentation as well.
Sure. Thanks, Doug. Good morning, everyone. I am David Kratville. I'm Environmental Program Manager at the Integrated Pest Control Branch here at CDFA. I've been working in the weed world since 1998. I was the last of the district weed biologists. And since around 2010-11, when the noxious weed program was cut at CDFA, I have been the only really dedicated staff to the noxious weed program at CDFA for the past, 14 years now. And much of that time, only a portion of my time was dedicated to the noxious weed program. I work on a number of other projects here at CDFA, but I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Trevor Fox. He came to us from the Delta Conservancy. His background there was in working on grants. So he has taken over my duties, and he's fully dedicated to the noxious weed program. But he is now the statewide weed coordinator, and Trevor will introduce himself a little bit. I'm just going to mention a few things. I wasn't able to talk in the chats. For one, the biocontrol on Tree of Heaven, Dr. Chris Borkent is on this call as well, and he did put a comment. I just wanted to make sure everyone saw it. Chris is the supervisor of our biological control program. And for Tree of Heaven, there's none permitted for the state, but a beetle, mite, and a pathogen are being looked at elsewhere in the country. Secondly, the current funds that folks are working on out there in California, those are under the Noxious Weed Grant Program, and that's funding that went to the counties directly. It's not WMA funding. So we're going to talk a little bit about WMA funding today, the future opportunity. So that gets kind of confusing. The current grants specifically went to the county ag commissioner's offices, and locally they may function in your county as if they're WMA funds, but that's sort of at the discretion of the ag commissioner. Doug, to answer one of your questions, all of these funding opportunities we were talking about, these are true grants. So there is no option to start work early outside the timeline defined in the RFP, which then becomes the scope of work. So there's no way to start to expend funds outside of that time period. I'm very happy to announce that we are looking at the potential of doing weed tours in 2025. I was just asked to look into the feasibility of that. Don't have any idea what that will look like, but we are hopeful that perhaps spring of next year we may be able to do another round of weed tours. If you can go into the next slide. So as Ed mentioned in the beginning of the talks, many of these noxious weed concepts are defined in the Food and Ag Code. And within that, weed management areas themselves are defined, and that's section 7270 to 7276. So these are localized organizations consisting of private, city, county, and state entities The purpose is to coordinate combined efforts to deal with common weed control problems. An analogy that we like to use is at CDFA, we are the regulatory and the lead agency for dealing with noxious weeds. It's almost like the regulatory aspect you could think of as the police department or sheriff's department, and then these NGOs and other localized governments, the counties and us sort of work hand in hand as sister agencies in that regulatory action. But then the local groups that build up the WMAs, and the WMAs bring these groups together. Those could be anyone from local landowners, your road department, state parks, the Forest Service, all of those entities which have the ability to work on their own private or personally, individually managed lands. We bring them together to make a coordinated effort across boundaries, across jurisdictions. But the overarching, the county and CDFA, we are the regulatory arm which are able to take action on those items. And we do have the authority, if necessary, to implement abatements and go on to lands that aren't specifically managed by us and conduct pest control work if it's deemed necessary. So next slide. Just a little bit more on WMAs. So yeah, the WMAs are not regulatory agencies. They're that additional layer of collaboration, and they're self-organized. And WMAs can apply for funding from CDFA for noxious weed management operations. And there is a big requirement for the submission of reports and mapping data. Trevor did give a presentation recently at the Pest Prevention University. Some of the county folks may have attended that. But we do have some new instructions coming out for mapping that will come along with the RFP when that comes out. And I'm stealing Trevor's thunder now, so I will hand it over to Trevor. He can introduce himself briefly, and he's going to handle the rest of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I'm Trevor Fox, and I'm a recent hire, I guess coming up on 1 year now for CDFA. Previously, my background was not in weeds or plants for that matter. I came from the insect world. So today's talks on Tree of Heaven were a particular interest to me, and with respect to the spotted lanternfly. So I appreciate those earlier talks. Getting into the weed world has been great, and it's been exciting working with everyone. And that's why I'm very excited to announce that we are finally ready to put out the RFP for the 2025 year. And that application, as David mentioned earlier, will open on December 1st, 2024. You'll have about 3 months, or it's exactly 3 months to complete the applications. During that time, we'll be running a Q&A session, the date of which will be announced after the RFP is posted. And that will include just a number of the common issues that we run into, but also kind of a refresher and some updates to our old mapping and reporting standards. They've been refreshed so that we can get more precise, accurate, and usable data out of these projects. We're looking at about $40,000 per WMA, and we're encumbering 3 years worth of funds for this. So this will be an ongoing process beyond this coming year. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just for your screenshots or your phone shots of this, we have the proposed timeline here. This will be in the RFP document, of course, but if you want to start putting stuff on your calendars, December 1st, we'll launch the RFP, and that will be launched at the URL at the bottom, grants.ca.gov. And we will also put out a general announcement. Likely, I'm sure you'll hear about it through Cal-IPC and other similar organizations. We're going to take March 15th through June 1st to do the review process, and then we'll announce funding on June 15th, and we're going for funds in hand by July 1st. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so shifting away from WMA specific information, I want to kind of just set the stage for CDFA's general mission when it comes to weeds. Our directive, our drive is mandated by 2 sections of code, starting with section 403. The department shall prevent the introduction and spread of injurious insect or animal pests, plant diseases, and noxious weeds. And that really is our primary function. If there is a new weed or organism coming into the state, we want to know about it. We want to assist in any way we can. It is ultimately our responsibility to deal with eradication matters. And then also in Food and Ag Code section 7271, that designates CDFA as the lead agency, lead department in any matters dealing with noxious weeds. And we're responsible for the implementation of all of the Food and Ag Code in conjunction with the Secretary of Natural Resources. So we take our weeds very seriously here, and we want to know if there are any incursions into the state or things that you guys know about that are that can potentially be a problem. And we rely on you guys quite a bit for that. Next slide, please. Okay, so we can't talk about weeds and prioritizing weeds without talking about the pest ratings. We need to know what's important, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen these identifiers before, but what you might not know is some of the more obscure letters that you don't see very often, or the ones that you might not necessarily be dealing with. So our weed ratings go from A to W, although I will note sometimes there is a P. P just means we don't have enough information to rate it, so you generally won't see that one too often. Starting with Q. Q is a suspected risk, but we need more information. Reasonable cause to hold commodity in shipment. If we find a Q-rated weed, we are able to hold that, especially if there's some indication that it has been a problem elsewhere, or it could be a problem in the state. A W just simply is a shorter way of saying that it's rated on the 4,500 list, which is the list defined by the California State Legislature of weeds that are very important and need to be controlled at all costs. And CDFA is bound to upholding that list and working on those organisms. Next slide, please. So the scariest and most important rating, the one that we all don't like to see, is the A rating. But what makes a weed an A-rated weed? Well, it's a pest of known economic or environmental detriment, and is either not known to be established in California, or it's present in a limited distribution. And why that's important is it means that we have a chance to contain it and eradicate it before it becomes a problem like Tree of Heaven, where it's C-rated now, I believe, because it's just so prolific, and we don't, there's not a great way to deal with it, even if it will become a problem. As we saw in the earlier presentations, it's quite difficult and quite widely distributed. So we want to catch A's before they have a chance to take hold in the state. That's why they're given the highest priority. B's are at county discretion, unless they're within a nursery, is my understanding. C's are the lowest priority, and again, that's mentioned with the geographic prevalence or naturalization. If it's been here for 150 years and it's everywhere in the state, that's not going to get as much attention as an A-rated weed that we just found in the Sierra foothills, and we have a chance to stop from spreading further south, further west, or where have you. And all of these rankings are established in Food and Ag Code section 5261 and 6461 if you needed some extra reading today during your lunch hour. Not sure that you want to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so what exactly goes into a rating? Well, when you submit a sample for rating, and I'll get to that URL on another slide here, or when you propose an organism for rating, the lab goes through a number of criteria, or our HQ goes through a number of criteria, starting with background and history, distribution, known effects, and the consequences of introduction. And I'll break down some of those some of those categories on the right here. We want to know what the initiating event is. How did you find it? And where exactly did you find it? The history and status. What do we know about the biology in other areas? Where is it distributed in the world? Are any other states controlling it? Is Oregon keeping an eye on this? Is this something that Arizona is after? That should raise some alarms. Also, where is it within the state of California? Again, if it's very widely distributed, that plays into the overall rating. Oh yeah, and then California interceptions. Have we been in situations where this weed has been regulated previously, be it at border stations, nurseries, ports, or seed receivers? Next slide, please. Okay, so just breaking down the consequences of introduction category a little bit further. This one gets into kind of the biology and the physiology of the plant. We look at climate host interactions. Again, great example, tree of heaven. Spotted lanternfly is a tree of heaven is a big host for spotted lanternflies, so that would absolutely factor into our risk assessment. How likely is it to spread? Is it just going to pop up in one place and stay there and not spawn a bunch of other plants? What is the economic impact? Is this going to impact agricultural crops within California? Is it going to damage our waterways, inhibit, wildlife biology prospects like salmon or other important animals? And also, what is the environmental impact? Exactly what damage will it cause to our natural resources, and what damage or how out of control could it get that we have to do a lot of damage ourselves to get rid of it? Next slide, please. You can find all of this information and stay up to date on our current ratings and ones that are up for public comment at this URL right here. That'll take you directly to the weed pest rating proposal site. There are pest rating links for vertebrates and inverts as well. But this is typically what you'll see on that page. It's a great resource. Next slide.
Hey, Trevor, this is Doug. Sorry to butt in. We're running a bit behind time, so I just want to encourage you to move quickly through the final slides if possible.
You got it. Yeah, we'll go into speed mode here. All right, so looking at biological control, we have three types of biological control, but most importantly, we just want to point out that we are doing biocontrol within the state. We have a very active program, as David mentioned. Chris is here. They do a lot of hard work to rear these populations, find the right organisms for the plants that we're trying to target. Next slide, please. That program was established in 1974, so it's quite mature at this point. They focus on classical biological control, and they've managed so far to do a significant reduction in weeds such as rush skeleton weed, Dalmatian toadflax, squaw rose knapweed, and the Mediterranean sage. You can see some adorable invert examples on the right-hand side here of them doing their work. Next slide. Thank you. All right, so this is a great set of images that was given me by Chris, showing exactly how successful biocontrol can be in this state. On the right-hand side here, you see a recreation area covered in Dalmatian toadflax. It was treated with a biocontrol beetle here. Looks to be a tenebrionid, but I might get that wrong. Then 2020 on the left, you can see that the biocontrol efforts were quite successful, and we've got one remaining plant over there on the left. So they did quite the number on that field. Next slide. This is a list of weeds of interest. For the sake of time, I won't list them off, but the biocontrol page will have some more information on these. Moving on. Okay, really quickly, I just want to touch on the success and the history of the hydrilla program. Tomorrow, I'll be giving a more in-depth talk on aquatic pests in the state, aquatic weeds. But a major part of our aquatic program is the focus on hydrilla. Hydrilla is a nasty invader that can cause severe problems for not only the wildlife in our waterways, but also recreation activities, and drown out a lot of native plants if left to spread. Its origin is likely the aquatic terrarium, I guess aquarium would be the right word, trade, as a plant likely from Florida, and it's made its way out here since 1976. However, as you can see on the right, we've managed to remove most of the plants throughout the state, and we're working towards total eradication. We have a few remaining sites being monitored in Clear Lake, and then a few sites being actively treated in Yuba and Nevada County, although we are hopeful that we are on the downhill section of this adventure. Moving on to the next slide. Next slide. Just really quickly want to mention that mapping is super important to us as far as what we get back from the WMAs. That's like one of the main deliverables. So we've updated our mapping procedures, and that will be covered at a later date. Later on, there's going to be a great talk, I believe, by Cynthia on the CalFlora organization and calflora.org. That is the primary mapping tool that we are using. It's important that we get the mapping data either sent to us so we can input it, or that it can be hosted or uploaded by you to CalFlora, and then we get some kind of receipt or evidence that it's been uploaded, so we know what's going on. On the right here, you can see a map of CalFlora Tree of Heaven reportings and distributions. So this is definitely a very valuable resource for us. Next slide. And finally, the last thing I'll mention is that we are in the process of forming a committee for the weed management areas to advise, analyze proposals, and just generally comment on the ongoings of the process. This is something that we're trying to form in the most equitable way possible. You can see a list of 11 different criteria for members of this committee, everything from livestock to ranching, government organizations, and NGOs. This is mandated in Food and Ag Code Section 7273. So this is something that will be happening, and you will be finding out more about as soon as we have it organized. Next slide. That's everything. Hopefully that wasn't too slow, Doug.
All right. Well, thank you, Trevor. I've got a few questions for you and David.
Yep.
One is, I think you said $40,000 per WMA. Is that per WMA or per county, given that some WMAs have 3 counties in them?
That will be, that's kind of the distinction from the NWGP funds, the Noxious Weed Grant Program. Those are per county. WMA is per WMA. So if your WMA consists of 2 counties or 1.5 counties, then they will split the money between all of them.
Interesting. Okay, great.
Doug, that's per year. So as we said, we're looking to encumber this for 3 years. This initial release is going to be for that first year, but the money will be potentially available for all 3 of those years. But this initial release will just be for 1 year for $40,000.
Got it. Okay, yeah, that answers one of the questions about the execution period. So this would be a July 1st through June 30th type grant. Okay. Is there a standardized MOU for WMAs in the works? Maybe that's something you'll talk about on the FAQ call later.
Yes, that's going to be an FAQ issue. Yeah.
Okay. Will there be an update on A-rated weeds list in the near future?
There.
Good, George.
Okay. Yeah, there will be. We've had a few more additions recently this year, so I've kind of held off on pushing it out. But now that it seems to just continuously be growing as we rate some of the unlisted weeds from the 4,500 list, probably just put out one for now since it's been requested.
Got it. Excellent. Well, great. Super exciting that funding is coming out. NWMAs have a bit of time to get organized to put their proposals together. And we'll be excited to see what kind of work gets done. We'll talk about that next year. Thanks again for joining from CDFA, and we will go to our final talks now. I am going to, let's see, say goodbye. Thanks, Trevor, and thanks, David. So I am going to show one slide from my talk, and then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Nikki. This is a slide showing how the WMA system works, because I know it's not necessarily clear to everybody. So starting up here with the legislature that's got money and ending up down in the bottom right with work getting done on the ground. So money from the legislature is put in the budget for CDFA, the California Department of Food and Agriculture. That's typically done because Cal-IPC is advocating for the legislature to do so. And by Cal-IPC, I mean not only us on staff, but all of you in the community, especially when we have a letter writing campaign and that kind of thing. CDFA gets money, they give grants to the WMAs, well, to the lead for the WMA, which is the Ag Commissioner or the RCD typically. In the top right is the oversight committee that Trevor just described, that is supposed to provide guidance on the use of the money. Then the WMA, or the lead for the WMA, the Ag Commissioner RCD, provides money through contracts to WMA partners based on what the WMA decides are its highest priorities. So that is a quick overview. I will take that off of the stage, and Nikki, why don't you join me, and let's take a quick spin through your PowerPoint, or however much of it we have time for.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I'm talking about monitoring invasive plant management. I'm Nikki Valentine. I'm a conservation specialist with the California Invasive Plant Council. And so as we've seen the invasion curve, it's super important to get on those early detection, rapid response, EDR species. It's just more cost effective. The more things get widespread, it's harder to contain. And so in an effort to address this need for coordinated EDRR, Cal-IPC partnered with CDFA to complete the regional prioritization process in 2021, and we collaborated with county ag commissioners and WMAs to determine which EDR weeds were present in their area. And the requirements for this was the weed had to be CDF rated, present in less than 10% of the region, and under management by most counties in the region. And these are the regions here. You can see they are multi-county. And there's 19 regions for all of California. California has 58 counties. So you can see the number of counties in each region on this table here. And the area is per square miles, just gives you an idea of how large the area is. And then we have number of regional EDR targets that were selected here. So you can see the desert is one of the largest areas, and it doesn't actually have any EDR targets. They weren't able to participate in this process. The Channel Islands technically has the most, but they're sort of doing their own thing. So if we look at actually the Southwest has the most regional EDR targets, at least for the landlocked areas. So next up, we had the most common EDR targets from this process were Dalmatian toadflax, spotted knapweed, Scotch thistle, and rush skeleton weed. It's pretty cool that there's this many counties or number of regions working on these weeds. That's just giving you a sense of how coordinated these areas, and some of them are pretty close together. And so we're going to be diving into looking at 3 separate regions, and all of the regions actually have the spotted knapweed as a EDR target. It's just a neat little thing. And so our goal for these EDR targets that we've selected is to visit and manage each population each year. And we like this to be reported in CalFlora so we can track it. So we're going to be looking at 3 different regions as examples. So the South Coast is LA and Ventura. Then we got the Southwest, which is Orange County, Western Riverside, so it's broken up by the watershed, and then San Diego. And then we got the Bay Area. I'm not going to list all those counties. You can see them here. And so we're going to look at their regional progress for 2023. So this is our comparison. You can see the number of counties. The Bay has the most. Area square miles, the Bay is still winning there. Number of EDR species, both the Southwest and the Bay have tied. They are the larger areas. And the number of populations that they had, EDR populations that were reported in these areas as of 2023. Southwest by far had the most, 714 populations. There's a lot of CalFlora use going on over there. And then the percent of populations visited in 2023, the Bay Area is visiting the most. But then the percent of populations that are managed in 2023, also the Bay is doing the most here. But I would like to give the Southwest the caveat that they have so many populations. They have like pretty much like triple than the other two. And so, yeah, we do want each population to be visited every year until it's no longer reported there. And so going here to look at this breakdown, I'll try to be brief, but you can see this dark, this is like the percentage of EDR populations. So this light gray is EDR populations that were not visited. And orange is they were visited, but there was no management status reported. And then the green is these populations were both visited and managed. And this red dot is the number of populations, which corresponds to this right-hand axis. So again, this is broken down by regions. These are the Bay over here going through to Sonoma. And then you have the South Coast here, Los Angeles and Ventura. And then you have the Southwest, Orange, Riverside, San Diego. And you can see the number of populations here for San Diego is the highest out of any of these counties. And so that is a nice marker to take in mind when you're looking at how many have been visited and managed. And then when you look at Marin, they have the most percentage visited and managed, about 70%, but they have some of the fewest populations reported of EDR populations in 2023. And so this is just breaking down some of the parameters we use to measure these results. So we included CalFlora records from 2010 to 2024. This included observation records, survey records, herbarium, and iNaturalist records. And we'll touch on those herbarium and iNaturalist records in a second. And then we did have a couple exceptions. There's desert knapweed in the San Diego County. It's being managed at its own rate, and the numbers in CalFlora are just overwhelming. Same with Japanese knotweed in Marin County. So we excluded those from this count because we didn't want to inflate any of the numbers. History stacks are counted as a single population. So if you're using history stacks in CalFlora, it's this cool tool where you can add on to a population and track management over time. And then populations of the same species within 25 meters of each other were counted as a single population. That was processed by us. So if you're doing a CalFlora search, you're not going to get these exact same output as I just showed here. And then we removed Cal Weed Mapper records because those are redundant with other data. And so again, our count totals are lower than a direct CalFlora search because we had a few exceptions and alterations to the data. And so what we considered managed is anything in CalFlora with a management status marked as under management or search for not found. There is also an eradicated field, but I know that's touchy. And I don't believe we have any EDR populations with that reported as of now. And so we do encourage people to use the search for not found option. Like if you're going to an old CalFlora observation site that hasn't been verified and just saying like, you haven't seen it if we're not sure it's there, or if you're visiting something that's been managed in the past and it's no longer there, just so we don't think it's an abandoned site or anything. And then herbarium records. There's a lot of herbarium records in CalFlora. These populations may no longer exist and may be inflating our number of EDR populations. So we encourage people to go out and visit these and make an observation and make a management status search for not found if you don't see it, or go ahead and put in what you are finding there and say it's verified. And so this is also a regional breakdown of who has the most herbarium records. And the Southwest has the most, but there was usually an observation record within the area of the herbarium records. So we only had 4% of herbarium records in the Southwest, which we're considering isolated herbarium records, where we're not sure if they're there or not. There's no other observation record in there. It's just the herbarium record, which you're not allowed to modify. So that's why we recommend making a new observation. In the Bay Area at 16%, that's a good amount. So again, we really encourage you to go out and visit those and let us know what's happening on the ground out there. iNaturalist records, those are also included in our counts, and they make up a significant percentage of EDR records. These records come from the community, so it's important to stay aware of these records and verify them. You can see the South Coast, 70% of their iNaturalist EDR records are coming from iNaturalist. Southwest is only 35%, but they did have the most EDR records, so it's good to keep in mind. So we also encourage, so these are some of our highlights and conclusions is half of Orange County's visits included management. That's awesome. We would like every visit to have management. We know it's not always realistic, but at least recording management status is a plus. And then the South Coast and the Southwest regions have less than 10% of isolated variant records as population. So as we went over it, those are being visited and reported. That's awesome. So what we're asking you to do is help track these regional EDR populations. It's cool to see what everyone's doing regionally and be able to report on that. So we encourage you to keep your records in CalFlora so that we can access them. There's options if you have private records to share them or keep them private, but be able to share the data with me. You can use history stacking to add new records for each visit so we can manage track management over time. And then mark the management status so we know what's going on there. And we know if you're able to treat it. We'd like to be able to report on this at a landscape level. And then sign up for email alerts, especially with the iNaturalist records. Like, it's good to know what's going on out there. There might be stuff coming in from the community. And we have set up a lot of those already in CalFlora through our regional prioritization group. And we have resources and training videos available at our site here. And it covers all of these asterisk items. And thank you all. That was it.
Wow. Nice work racing through that.
I hope we didn't go too fast.
No, that was great. And it's great to hear that CDFA is also using CalFlora as their primary source. And so are we. And so the basics of keeping tabs on visits to populations in CalFlora and checking the management status for, whether you're doing management or not, that alone can go a long ways towards tracking at the landscape level. And also for yourselves tracking progress and probably reporting to CDFA. Quick question, and this may be one for Cynthia, but she's not here, so you can try to answer it, Nikki. Using Observer Pro in the field, can you mark searched for not found? Can you check the management status field? Do you know?
I believe you can mark management status in the field, but honestly, I don't use Observer Pro in the field a lot, so I would check with Cynthia. Okay. And I know she's been active in the chat.
Yeah, so she may answer that. Also, whatever you've done in the field, in Observer Pro, once you upload it, you can also work with it on your computer. It would be nice to be able to do it in Observer Pro if you can, but answer that one, Cynthia, if you can. All right, thanks everybody. Sorry we went a little long, but hopefully you got a lot out of that.